So yeah, we are here obviously today to talk about diversity in leadership, talking about what it takes to build, lead and sustain a diverse workforce, the policies that need to be implemented from the top down in an organisation, and the challenges and the pitfalls in implementing said policies. So Anna, hand over to you.
Yeah, so we're really excited today because we've got two really great guest speakers who have quite a bit of experience, I suppose, in the area of diversity and inclusion within their respective fields. And I think Paradigm obviously being in the global mobility sphere, it's, you know, diversity and inclusion is something that I suppose is intrinsically so a part of what all of us do on a day-to-day basis, that it might not necessarily even be something that we actively think about, but is something that affects our actual day-to-day work all the time, and often will affect the clients that we're dealing with, as well as the people that we work with and for. So the first speaker that we have up today is Zahir Ahmed. Zahir is an award-winning diversity and inclusion thought leader, and he's currently the global head of inclusion and diversity for consumer healthcare at GSK. Prior to this, he was the head of strategic delivery for the central D&I department at Ernst & Young, and he was responsible for leading the race innovation and thought leadership strategies for the firm, and chaired the firm-wide race working group. He has quite a lot of experience. He's a highly decorated former police officer as well, having served in various departments, including uniform policing, Force Intelligence Bureau, and murder investigation. He's also worked closely with the Ministry of Justice as a member of the Race Advisory Board, and he's a former race advisor to the Arsenal Football Club. That's a whole lot more than experience that I certainly have, and so many years of experience working with so many different industries and companies as well. So he is going to talk a little bit about his experience with diversity and inclusion, and the challenges that he's found, and areas that he's thought have, you know, gone progressed really well, and areas that I think he feels need more work. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have a bit of time for questions. So if you've got any, note them down as he goes along, and we'll cover them afterwards. So over to you, Zahir.
Thank you, Anna, for that lovely introduction. And hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you about diversity and inclusion. Let me start by saying that in addition to what Anna's shared, I've been fortunate enough over the last sort of 20 years to work with hundreds of organizations in a voluntary capacity. In the last 5 years alone, I've advised over 100 organizations, from global reputable names, technology giants, to small startups. So it's fair to say that I have a fairly good idea of what's happening within the corporate world when it comes to D&I. So let me start by giving you an idea of where I think we are, where the journey started. So my career sort of spans over 25 years, public and private sector, what it was like when I started, where we are now, and what are the sort of key challenges. And then there will be an opportunity, towards the end, for a Q&A, and I would welcome a Q&A. So please make a note if you have any questions that you would like to ask me. So let me start by saying that my career started, as I said, 25 years ago with Warner Brothers, and at that time D&I was simply a poster on a notice board. That's as far as the D&I efforts went. There was no policy, no strategies, no D&I team, and it just a fancy statement which read well but meant nothing. There were no initiatives, interventions in place, no recruitment targets or leadership targets in place. Over the last 25 years, I've seen a significant change globally, whereby, companies around the world have incorporated diversity, equity, inclusion into their visions and strategies. So it's very much now, for many organizations, a business imperative. However, where the challenge lies, the biggest challenge, in my opinion, lies in representation. So progress on representation has been slow. A few companies are making real strides, but mainly around gender. So our progress on D&I space on gender, it's something that we can give ourselves a little pat on the back for, but not the progress that we would like to make. But I acknowledge that we've made progress, but there's still a long way to go. Diversity is not, the way I look at diversity is in twofold. So workforce diversity, that's numbers. So who's coming in, who we're recruiting, who we're attracting, and who's in the room. But then there is a separate piece which is around workplace inclusion. Who stays with us, who thrives and is successful. So I apply two different lenses to when I look at diversity, equity, and inclusion. Who comes in and who stays with us, and that helps me understand what's happening, because it's a very big topic. There are a number of groups and subgroups that require our energy, attention, and effort from the DEI point of view. What we do know about diversity is what we've learned in the sort of last 10 years mainly, is that diverse teams will outperform any non-diverse team. There is growing body of evidence that suggests that, and that diversity drives innovation because people of different backgrounds and experiences are likely to approach situations differently, providing a more diverse spread of ideas. There is also evidence, mainly, I'm going to quote McKinsey report that tells us that gender diverse firms are 25% more likely to financially outperform others. And ethnically diverse companies are 36% more likely to financially outperform their peers. We also know that organizations that are rated highly for both diversity and inclusiveness have 19% higher retention rate, 42% better team commitment, and 57% better team collaboration. The business case on diversity inclusion is solid. I don't make that business case anymore. I'm going to be very open and frank with you. I've come to a point where I have stopped making the business case to my own organization and the other organization that advise. And my simple view on this is that never in my career I have ever been asked to make a business case for white men, for example, the dominant majority. Yet when it comes to women or any minorities, ethnicity and beyond, I'm often faced with this question: well, how would that help us become a better organization? What is the impact on the organization, on the growth, on the success, on the future of the organization? So for me, it's, I don't make that, it's a personal choice. I don't, as a DEI, global head of DEI in GSK, I don't make that business case. And I encourage my leaders not to ask me that question, because this is not just about the business case. This is very much about who we are as an organization, what we believe in, as, going sort of the humanity piece, rather than coming into, a business and asking, who do we need to what kind of people that we need to bring into the organization which would make us look good to the outside world. It's not about that. It's not about representing the communities. It's not about representing the consumers. It's doing the right thing, because in a hyper-connected world, in a diverse world, it is the right thing to do. So that is something I want to make sure that, I get across to the audience. Now, let me just cover a couple of things. I've talked about the progress we made on gender. I've talked about there is many organizations have now, made D&I as a business imperative, is very much part and parcel of the culture. Many senior leaders, CEOs, chairmen are very much engaged in DEI, which is very positive. We also have more champions, more D&I allies, more investment in the DEI space. However, at the current rate of progress, it will take 29 years and 24 years, respectively, for average US and UK company to reach gender parity on its executive teams. So 29 years for US and 24 years for UK to reach gender parity. Gender parity is like 50-50. That's what we mean by gender parity. And 18 years and 13 years on board, respectively. So when we look at the progress we've made, yes, it's great, but the progress has been painfully slow, particularly in senior leadership. And when I talk about senior leadership, I actually mean board -1 and 2. That's where the key representational challenge lies. At the junior levels, we've got plenty of diversity. At the mid sort of management level, we've still got healthy numbers. But as you start to move to the top, take any organization, whether they are global or not, the chances are highly likely you will find that the board, the executive leadership team is predominantly white and male dominated. That's one of the biggest challenge within the DEI space. I'm going to talk about 3 things, and then I'm going to pause to see if there are any questions or for me. And these are sort of things that I want to leave you with, and something that you could apply, these lenses to when you're looking at diversity and inclusion, whether it's in your organization or anywhere else. And these 3 things are self-inquiry, intersectionality, and equity. Let me start with self-inquiry. We need to look at ourselves with an intense personal honesty and in the context of allyship, with the focus of uncovering our own biases, preferences, privilege, and power. Only by being honest with ourselves about our own biases and privilege that we can recognize the lens which may distort our actions as an ally. And it's only by understanding our power that we can identify where we can focus our allyship efforts. True understanding of bias, privilege, and power comes from deep work, for example, building cultural intelligence, conversations with diverse communities that is different to our own. So self-inquiry, we need to ask ourselves individually that what we are doing, what are our preferences, biases, and privileges. Second, intersectionality. Not very often talked about, but a very, very important subject or topic within the D&I space. Often, we kind of sort of, we almost forget about it, and because we focus on gender, ethnicity, LGBT plus, disability agents, or so on and so forth. The term intersectionality highlights the fact that any individual's life experience is complex, and that a person could experience interdependent, overlapping forms of marginalization or systemic oppression based on categorization such as race, ethnicity, gender, social class, or sexual orientation, and the list goes on. There is a lot of work that needs to be done to embrace intersectionality and better understand the multiple identities that we all have. Finally, it's the piece around equity. For me, I take an approach that if you're not talking about equity in your organization, that you're not very serious about D&I. It's as simple as that. Equity is the fair treatment and equality of access to opportunity, information, and resources for all. Without equity, even the most diverse companies will have one-dimensional leadership teams. And let me also say, equity does not undermine equality. It's not about taking the opportunity from one to giving it to another. It's about equity of opportunities. It provides the means to achieve true equality. Equity is the key to driving engagement for specific employee demographics. it levels the playing field. Most organization assumes that the starting point for all their employees is exactly the same, which is incorrect. It addresses the differing needs of minority groups by bridging the gap between minority and majority groups. So the three things I would like you to remember is self-inquiry, start with yourself, remember intersectionality, and also look at how you organizations, your organization and others are leveling the playing field and providing equity of opportunities to all of its employees. Now, let me just pause there. I know I've been talking for a while and I'm keeping an eye on the clock as well. So let me just pause there, see how that talk has landed and if there are any questions.
Yeah, so here I can see that there's a couple of questions that have come through in the chat, so maybe we can start with those. The first question is from Sherry, who asked, when you indicated that there's been progress on gender diversity, are you referring to more women in the corporate world or in leadership, or do you feel that the progress on gender diversity also includes a more open spectrum, so people who are genderless or non-binary and the entire spectrum?
I'm talking purely from a corporate lens. So the way we measure gender is men versus women or women versus men. So this is very much about, that's how corporate world measures the progress on gender. So it is very much women versus men, and mainly around senior leadership positions. So most organizations have targets on senior leadership, mainly VP and above kind of thing. But I recognize every organization is different, and they may have entry level targets for on gender and some mid sort of management targets as well. But when I talk about gender progression and the progress on gender, I'm coming from the point of view of women versus men.
Okay, thanks. And the second question is from Corinne, who's asked, do you think that the slow pace of change with this diversity and inclusion policy in organizations is a direct result of the lack of diversity or allyship or interest in DEI at the board level?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's a very broad question. I think it depends, and it may vary from organization to organization as well. Yes, it is about, allyship has been sort of, talked about a lot in the last sort of, since Black Lives Matter. Before that, it wasn't something as mainstream as it has become now. So yes, it is around allyship. Yes, it is about interest, but it's also about capabilities. It's about confidence within the DEI space. It's also about maturity within the organization. There is no one size that fits all, but ultimately I am looking for, and it's also about, and one thing that I often talk about, that if an organization does not have a dedicated team driving DEI initiatives, then I would put a question mark on their commitment to DEI. So it's a combination of things, but ultimately the ownership needs to sit with the CEO, the person responsible for the entire organization, accountable for the performance of the entire organization. And finally, I would say is lack of accountability as well. I think we have let many senior leaders almost get away with the lack of progress on DEI because the accountability frameworks does not exist. And I'll give you one very simple example, and it's a UK-based example, but it's very relevant to this question that during my time in the police service, and I spent over nearly 14, 15 years in the police service, we had our operational targets, so reducing robberies, detecting burglaries, so on and so forth. And then we have our non-operational targets at the bottom of the page, which were DEI type targets. Operational targets are very much linked to performance of the senior chief officers, linked to their bonuses, linked to their rewards. Every effort is made to achieve those operational targets. Every effort, no stone will be left unturned, by the chief officers, if we are on track not to achieve those targets. Yet, when it came to the DEI targets, whether we achieve them or not many people would ask questions. It's not part of the sort of annual conversations. Our external stakeholders do not have a platform through which they can hold the senior officers to account for not achieving those targets. So I think the biggest thing that stands out for me is lack of accountability coupled with transparency. So transparency is also part of the reason why there's been a slow pace, painfully slow, I would say.
Renee's just said something as well. She's asked, are frameworks such as sustainable development goals not considered within that?
No, they're not. Most organizations will shy away, including my own, shy away from considering any external frameworks. So for organizations like GSK, EY, and other similar global companies, it would be ideal for us to develop our own accountability framework internally, which works for us. And yeah, I would be reluctant to say that there is one size that fits everybody. Yes, it would be ideal to have some consistency, but yeah, it's not. Yeah, it doesn't work in the real world.
One final question. Oh, sorry, Ben, you had a question?
Yeah, just a question to hear. I'm just wondering about like DE and I and how much of a discussion it is in countries and region where maybe it is more of a challenge, like the Middle East, for example, where it's potentially there are some countries, or in Asia as well, or in Africa, where it's maybe a bit more sensitive and a bit more of a challenge. A company like GSK, or just generally, like, what can countries that have more of a discussion on it, like the UK and the US, do to help actual countries where it's not being discussed? We have a lot of people here from South Africa or Mauritius, and I don't know how advanced the discussion is on diversity, equity, inclusion, but what can we do to the country, with the countries that actually it's a lot more sensitive? I know Naran's really interested in the Middle East, and that's something I'm curious to know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, that's a great question. And first and foremost, what we need to recognize that Western held views are not always welcomed in other parts of the world. So I'm always mindful of saying, telling my colleagues in Singapore, for example, or India, that this is what we're going to do, because you need to recognize and acknowledge the local nuances. The world is incredibly diverse, and the challenge we have within the DEI space, gender, we can take a global approach. Age, we can take a global approach. Disability is pretty much sort of take a global approach. The challenges we have is around, at the moment in the current context, is around race and ethnicity. The interpretation, the definition of race changes from country to country, makes it very difficult for us to track and measure. Employment law, prevents us from collecting, and where we can collect, where privacy restrictions will prevent us from reporting on race and ethnicity. So if I give you an example of, if you take Singapore, in our office in Singapore, there are 40 nationalities. Yet none of them identify, when we ask them the question on race and ethnicity, they do not pick the options that we have for US and UK. For them, it's very much about heritage. For them, it's very much about culture and nationality. If you take China, for example, the government position is that we're all Chinese, and we need to respect that. But if people bring up diversity, it's more about region, province of China they come from, and it's very much about a casual way to introduce themselves. In India, there are cultural, community, and religious nuances, where particularly when it comes to ethnicity conversations, as well as socioeconomic caste, many people will make a case for why the intersectionality makes them a minority. So, when it comes to race and ethnicity, and I keep focusing on race and ethnicity, and I want to make a point that that is a number one priority for most organizations in the context of BLM. And it is also because it is one of the most complex dimension of diversity in a global context. No organization with a global footprint has an answer to this, and we're all trying to figure out, how we approach the GSK. When we talk about ethnicity, we have ethnicity representational targets for US and UK only, and we are actively working with a number of law firms to identify which countries, from a legislative point of view, we can start to collate the data with the view of a future, in the future, having ethnicity representational targets. So complex, but allow the local country to encourage the local country to have the conversation in the way that they see fit is what I would advise, rather than imposing something from the center, or from the the global point of view, particularly from a Western lens. That is not always welcomed.
Thank you.
I know you're on mute.
So I put myself on mute. I know. I wanted to ask one last question from Charlotte because I think it's interesting. So here, do you think that working from home might affect the balance of things?
Simple answer is I don't know. Where there are benefits for working from home, there are also it may disadvantage some people as well, particularly when it comes to performance management, when it comes to who we reward, what kind of work we reward. And we know that there are some minority groups who are most likely to be at a disadvantage working from home because they simply can't get into the office and have that face time with senior leaders. And this there's also this culture of this social sort of culture of an organization, these get-togethers, which are not not happening that often now, but this team gathering, team building type, even at the official meetings, if you're in the room, you're more likely to influence your senior leader, whilst as compared to somebody who's working from home. I'm not entirely sure if it will provide the right balance. I think if it does, there will be people who will be disadvantaged from working from home as compared to those who choose to go into the office, or who can go into the office and have that audience with the right people. So yeah, I don't know. I think time will tell, and we still haven't figured out that hybrid working model. What does that look like, and what does the future hold for organizations like GSK? One thing we're trying to do is not mandate how many days people would work from. We have shied away from that. It's very deliberate, very intentional, because we don't know what works for our people. So we are putting our trust in our people, empowering them to make the right decision which works for them, rather than saying that you will be in the office for 2 days or 3 days a week.
I've got a quick question, Zahir, around the inclusivity part within organizations. I speak to a lot of HR teams who are really struggling with the inclusivity piece, and a lot of their challenges around two things really. So it's a slightly two-part question. First is around gathering data around inclusivity. How do we kind of efficiently, effectively gather data so that it's anonymous, but the people that we need the data from feel they're in a safe space to be kind of openly honest, to provide data about whether they feel kind of included or not. And the second part to that question is, potentially once we've gathered this data, and there's always improvements to be made, how do we justify the associated costs that sometimes HR have to then provide as part of the business case to the senior leadership team around additional resources, support, tools, etc., that are required for inclusivity?
Great question. Let me try to answer this in a very simplistic way. I'm a big fan of data. Data is powerful, not just being data led, but data informed as well. So what you're talking about is, I believe it's being data informed. So it's understanding what's happening in your workplace. So very much around inclusion. So we, many organizations do it in different ways. We in GSK, and we're not perfect, and I should have said that from the beginning, we're not perfect. We've got our own challenges, we're on a journey kind of thing, but we're making some significant progress within the DEI space. So we do through this number of ways. So we have our the standard employee survey that we do, and we will invest heavily. Since I've come in, I've invested in that particular data set to ensure that it gives us various different cuts. If we want to interrogate the data, we can interrogate it by down to individual office in anywhere in our company globally, because before it was just a blanket data divided by functions, and that's it. So that's what we do. We also, something that I'm very proud of and something we recently started, is we have a number of employee resource groups, for people, led by people, then we have a number of them. They organize a lot of conversations, safe spaces and everything, and we very openly, very transparently, we work collaboratively with them, and we ask them to share with us anonymous aggregate data of what people are saying, where they're joining from, what are the trends emerging from their conversations, and their members are aware. So this is not something done behind the scenes kind of thing. So that is something that gives us, and it's interesting, you can see the difference between what people are saying on one set of data and what they're saying on an employee resource group, which is very open, very frank, unedited version, and that is incredibly powerful. So, and that helps us take a very informed decisions on what we need to do in terms of investment. I'm not really entirely sure. For us, it's my CEO. It's very much about this is demonstrating commitment to DEI. If we don't understand, we can't measure our progress on DEI, then I guess what is the point of doing anything? So you need to know your baseline, where you're starting from. You need to know when and how and where you're making the progress, and data is incredibly powerful in telling that story, along with a narrative, a compelling narrative that comes together with the data sets. So I think it's just continue to the business case or the business case for investment is there. We just need to I guess keep banging on about it. And I recognize not every organization you'll get what you need to be able to deliver, but it is incredibly important for us to demonstrate, not just to our leaders but to our people, that we're making progress and we're learning. We know where the challenges lies, so we can have interventions tailor-made for that particular part of the organization rather than a blanket approach again. So yeah, it's demonstrating our commitment to our people more than so our leaders. That is the how I would approach if I'm seeking more investment in the DEI space. I know we've gone over time, and I'm really mindful of, because
thank you so much for that, Zahir. I think we're all grateful that you were able to answer those questions, and then we had some really really good insightful questions as well. But I think I will hand over to Corinne now to introduce our next speaker.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks to Zahir. That was great. Thank you so much. So yes, on to our next speaker. Her name is Jeanette Thompson. She is a partner in the regulatory team of UK law firm Kingsley Napley. She trained in the NHS, the National Health Service, and started her career exclusively defending doctors and dentists. And she's also built up, I thought this was really interesting, she's built up a niche in advising businesses in the cannabis sector, which is quite cool. She's very passionate about diversity and inclusion. She has special interests in race, ethnicity, and social mobility. She has spoken on many panels about her own journey, and also in advising firms on what they can do to bring about change in the legal profession. So without further ado, Jeanette.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Zahir's a tough act to follow, and I was tapping notes myself of points that he was making. So just with the caveat that I suppose in a way fell into D, E and I, mainly because of my own struggles, I think, working my way through the profession. The very first firm that I worked at, it was a real struggle pretty much every day, to the point that my well-being was suffering by the time that I decided that I was going to leave that firm. And I left that firm with the very clear view in my head that I was going to do more targeted kind of research, I guess, about a firm, that its culture spoke for itself. People spoke highly of it, because I didn't want to go through that experience again. And I'm glad to say that I landed at Kingsley Napley and all has gone well. I started at Kingsley Napley in 2011 as an associate. I became a senior associate in 2015 and then a partner in 2020. So the trajectory was no means quick. There were stumbling blocks along the way, and at points where I had to kind of pull myself up by my bootstraps and recognize the fact that I could do it. And one of the things that I felt helped me very immensely throughout that time was having a champion. And that champion is not necessarily, and I think this is one of the things that I probably misinterpreted at the beginning of my career. I'd always assumed that my champion would in some way look like me and potentially come from a similar background to me, and actually completely different. She is white, she's from New Zealand, she identifies as a lesbian, and that is not me breaking any confidences. She is very actively speaking about this. And she was the one person that I was able to always kind of bounce ideas off of. She was already a partner, so I could get that kind of mentoring from her. She was the person that said the good things about me when I was outside of the room. One thing that I always say to people when they come to speak to me is, you cannot always be in the room. And when you're outside of the room, you need someone that is fighting your corner. And I found that. And it's one of the things that I think is very important about finding. Now, onto the kind of more broader piece and what I do at Kingsley Napley. I am the chair of the REACH group, which is our race and ethnicity and cultural heritage group. And essentially, when I was thinking about what I would say today, I actually found a quote from myself, quite funnily, when I had spoken to people in HR magazine. And this was what I said. I said, there can unfortunately be a tendency to farm diversity and inclusion out to people who don't necessarily have the decision-making ability. It can't just sit with HR and D&R teams. It must have senior management buy-in to encourage cultural change and make a real difference. There's no point in setting targets otherwise, because it means the organization isn't ready to make that cultural shift. And I very much stand by that. All organizations, as Zahir was talking about, none of us are perfect. We are trying to make a way. And I think it's very poignant that Zahir said that he doesn't make the business case for DE&I anymore, because you don't have to make the business case for any organization to take on kind of a white male. And that is not said rudely, it's just a plain fact. So why do we have to make the business case for organizations to be more diverse? I very much come from the background of diversity and inclusion being the right thing to do. Yes, organizations want to talk about money very often, but my standpoint is it's the right thing to do. We should be all trying to make the playing field level as possible. And I wanted to touch on intersectionality as well, because one of the things that is very important in organizations when you are thinking about your cultural shift is not making assumptions. Very often people will make assumptions that people who are from an ethnic minority must also have been from a lower social mobility background. That is not true. There are many people from an ethnic minority who are actually quite well-to-do, would consider themselves to be in, and I hate using the word, but middle class. And therefore, when you make those type of assumptions, you are automatically closing the culture in your environment, in your organization, to make people feel that they are on the outside because of the fact that you've made an assumption based on their presentation in terms of their race and ethnicity. So when it comes to intersectionality, it's very important to not just focus on one aspect, but also not to make assumptions. And that really came home to me, not just in terms of myself, but also we have a book club at Kingsley Napley where we read books from diverse authors. And we read one of those, Rennie Edo-Lodge's Why I Am No Longer Talking to White People About Race. And a really key part in that book was when she talks about kind of the feminism movement, and when she realized that she went to a feminist group that was largely made up of white women, and her voice simply wasn't being heard. She realized that her story was very different to a lot of women in that room based on her race and ethnicity, which is why intersectionality becomes so important. Now, there's no point in having organizations if it's only people within a very small section of the organization that are galvanized to make change. It has to include senior leadership teams. And that is one of the things that I've been very key, and why I think we have been so successful in the last couple of years, because our senior partner in 2018, who I built up a very good relationship with, then decided that his platform was going to be, in his time as senior leadership, improving diversity and inclusion at the firm. And that really helped me have someone that I could go to with all of my ideas, with all of my thoughts about the organization and taking it forward. And without having that senior leadership buy-in, I don't think we would have made the progress that we certainly have made, such that we were able to kind of win awards and be recognized for what we are doing. I think the other thing that's very important is not setting targets without having proper data analysis. So firms like Stevenson Harwood have committed to having kind of 10% ethnic minority partners in place by May 2025 and 30% ethnic minority trainees by the same year. Slaughter and May has done something similar where it set itself a 40% target for female annual equity partners by 2027. But the biggest mistake I think that organizations can make when setting those targets is picking something that's unachievable, where they haven't enacted cultural change within the organization. The policies are not actually representative of their population, and they haven't actually analyzed the data that they have in terms of the people they have at different levels, and gain an understanding of the external factors that may impact their ability to attract certain groups. So first of all, you have to look at your kind of immediate local demographic. You need to look at the types of organizations that you are liaising and contracting with. Are you using diverse job boards? Are you doing outreach? Are you going to universities, schools, etc., that have proper representation, or are you going to only Russell Group universities? So it really does take the organization to properly think about how it is going to reach those targets and not just setting them blindly. The other thing that's really important is recruitment processes. At Kingsley Napley, one of the things that we have done is worked with other organizations like Rare Recruitment that looks at contextual recruitment. So it looks at not just what the grades that people get, but looking at them as an intersectional person and the context in which they went to school, how they were brought up, and how they are now, to see what their trajectory would be. Those types of recruitment processes and looking at your recruitment process is really important. One of the things that I am not shy about saying is that I work very closely with our human resources department around our trainee pool, because I'm the trainee principal for the firm. And I asked them to analyze very clearly the data of kind of what demographic of applications we were getting, and at each point that they were being sifted out of the process, because I was very concerned about the fact that I was seeing the same types of faces every year when we went through our trainee recruitment process. And when we looked at that, we realized that people from ethnic minorities were being sifted out at the very first stage. Now, that stage was the stage where no lawyer has ever seen their application. It's only dealt with by HR. And we needed to then enact some real change and development and discussion about why that was happening. One of the things that we did was all go through ethnicity training together. I don't like the word, but unconscious bias, but that's what it's called, unconscious bias training, and really drilling down into what we felt from our practices was causing that to happen. One of the other things that we've enacted is kind of a policy which we've ingrained into our dress and work policy is the HALO code, which protects employees from discrimination about racial, ethnic, religious, and kind of cultural identities, especially associated with hairstyles. I will not if I could count the amount of times that someone has said to me that someone has touched their hair, asked them, is that all yours? How did it grow from yesterday? And all those types of comments that make people feel on the outside, enacting very clear policies that have teeth, that people are actually willing to stand behind, is very important for culture and cultural shift. We've also made it a part of our business plan. So our business plan has a distinct plank for diversity and inclusion, which says that we are going to develop our brand to demonstrate that we are an authentic, responsible and inclusive employer of choice, putting the firm in the best possible position to attract and retain talent from a diverse pool. And it's not just the attract, it's the retain, because there's no point, and I always say this, of getting people into an organization if the culture is such that as soon as they get there, they realize that they are not really part of the wider group, and then they leave and they take that talent elsewhere. We've done things like signing up to 10,000 Black interns, where we offer paid work experience opportunities to Black students throughout the summer, and we're going to be doing that for the next 5 years. It's been really important, I think, for me, the most important thing is getting that senior leadership buy-in. And I very much, as I say, approach it from the basis of this is the right thing to do. Yes, it is going to make us more profitable in the future, but that should not be the basis upon which you are doing it. You should be doing it because of the fact that you are using your position of privilege, and now my position of privilege as a partner, in order to bring people along on the journey with us. And that is so important, not only for us as an organization, but for serving our community and the clients that we work for. I think the last thing I wanted to say is that we've also signed up to Legal Core, which is a leadership-led, and that is the important part of it, the leadership-led cross-firm collective aimed at tackling the underrepresentation of Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups in the UK legal sector. And that is firms like us, Clifford Chance, Slaughter May. And it's, whilst I went to the first meeting, my role was to go to that first meeting, check it out, and then pass it on to the senior and managing partner for them to very much get engaged with the other individuals in the room. So I basically endeavor to hold myself to account, but I do that through bringing senior leadership along with me.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. That was great. We've got a question in the chat box here from Renee. So I'll just read it out. It says, I agree that there should not be a business case for DE&I, but often those who should be in the room are often not able to be from an education perspective. How do we as businesses focus on a business case to uplift and educate people to ensure there are the right skills in the room? The SDGs again help from a much bigger picture, and I'm concerned that big organisations are not considering a global view, which may mean if we don't look broader and deeper, we will struggle with talent into the future.
Yeah, Zair's already mentioned the McKinsey report, which is very clear about the way in which diverse workforces can basically future-proof a business. But because of the fact that diverse thought thinking, bringing in people from lots of different backgrounds, really does translate into figures and profitability and productivity. But I think one of the things that's very important, and I've always said from the perspective of working in a UK law firm, there's no point in getting that diverse talent in if what you do is essentially mold them to become exactly what we already have at the firm. You want to keep that diverse thinking and make them part of the culture, not change who they are, because I think that is unfortunately one of the things that many people have reported to me that has happened. So if you're looking at it from a business case, definitely drawing kind of all of the research that there has been, and I've had to do that in the past, all the research that there is. The McKinsey report is one of the best reports out there, but there is also kind of more government-led reports, etc., that will really help. So definitely kind of putting facts, figures. Matthew Saeed's Rebel Ideas has some really good stats and statistics in it about how diverse workforces are more productive and are more profitable. So when you need to make the business case, go in with the heavy guns, look at the figures, give them kind of, this is how we could make change in our organization, and this is what it means for us for the next 5, 10 years, or however forward you can do, but you've also got to cross-reference that with where you are now. So look at the picture of the demographic of the organization that you are in and just show them how it correlates to local, kind of national, and perhaps global community. Where are you underrepresented? Have you looked at why you're underrepresented? And just talk about some of the things that could mean for your future business. So it definitely does need to be done in some circumstances, but it's not the basis in which I always go in.
Thank you. We've also got Kim Loy. She's got her hand up. Kim Loy, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Corinne. Good morning, everyone. Shanette, thank you so much for that presentation. It was very impactful. I have a question. I am from the Caribbean. I'm from Jamaica. How do you possibly foresee this situation translating into a different sort of demographic, where in the Caribbean, though there is a cultural mixture, there is also a majority of sort of an Afrocentric background, so to speak, because I find for myself, though our population is predominantly Black, as you have indicated, from a senior position, there is still the men at the helm at higher positions, but yet there is the juxtaposition that Jamaica is one of the countries in the world that has the highest rate of female leadership, and yet I still find myself unrepresented in the decision-making process and how that works. So even though there is a higher ratio of women in leadership, I consistently still find myself and my ideas unrepresented. And even in the workforce that is around me, I find that the demographic in it and of itself somewhat affects how decisions and ideas are shared, and sometimes I feel to the detriment of my team based on the demographic that is there. How do you perhaps find that what you have spoken about, the McKinsey report, which is something I'll have to look into, how does that affect a business or a company where in it and of itself, it is on the surface representative of the vast community, of the majority of the community?
No, that's a very good point. And I obviously I can only speak from the perspective of having worked and done this work in a UK law firm. So as Zaire has already said, you know, some of the Western points of view, some of the Western ways, in inverted commas, are not necessarily going to translate to all other places around the world. What I would say, though, coming from a Jamaican family myself, where both parents were born on the island, so I was the first generation born outside of it, I think one of the things, I totally agree with you, one of the things that can be tricky across the Caribbean, including Jamaica, is that whilst in terms of race and ethnicity, less of an issue, there is definitely an issue around gender. Now, I think in those circumstances, what I would be doing is to look into more local research, to be quite frank, not necessarily trying to translate reports that have been drafted kind of in the UK and America, although they can be helpful. Looking at local research, looking at how the business is faring, just having a very clear, and one of my friends who works at Clifford Chance, which is a global firm, did a D&I presentation for them. And what she did was go around their website and show them in pictorial fashion how many clicks she had to do in order to get to a senior female. And it showed that getting to a senior male, she could do it in one click. Getting to a senior female took around 25 to 30 clicks. And she said, well, why is that? What are we doing as a business? Why is it in certain jurisdictions where the overwhelming majority of lawyers, for example, are female, why is it that there are still no females in senior position? Why is there such a high level of attrition of females from junior up to senior roles? There are lots of factors that play into that, but culture is likely to be one of the senior factors. And I think sometimes you have to just shine the light directly on those issues and then try to get buy-in from that senior team. Now, I could never guarantee that they are going to listen, but there is always the case to make, and perhaps using local and more government-led research in Jamaica and other jurisdictions is the way to go. But I appreciate the fact that I can only speak from the perspective of having worked and doing D&I work here.
Thank you. Thanks, Kimberly, for that question. Does anyone else have any questions for Shanette?
I've got
Okay, you go.
Noran, you go.
Just a quick question in addition to diversity targets with relation to ethnicity and race. I was curious about both from a Kingsley-Napley perspective and a GSK perspective, targets or progress around diversity within LGBTQ plus communities, as well as neurodiversity and disability diversity. And I still don't think they're getting kind of enough airtime at the moment in general. So I was just curious if organizations are at the start of creating targets around those or kind of in discussion stages.
Absolutely, I agree. And the way in which we approach it at Kingsley-Napley is that we have one large diversity and inclusion committee, but then there are subspecialty groups which each take forward their area. So my responsibility is around race and social mobility, but then we also have a disability group, we have a working parents, and so on and so forth. So each group has got a target and a progress to make, and each of our groups have kind of got aligned targets, not in terms of numbers, but in terms of retaining and in terms of attracting, and retaining the diverse talent in their own areas. Now, I am also part of the disability group, but I am not in kind of running that group. And that is one of the things that I have been very concerned about. Our figures in terms of LGBTQ plus are really coming along. There's lots going on there. But in terms of neurodiversity, we are really, really lacking. We are lacking people not only that want to actively put their head above the parapet to say that they necessarily have a disability. We still have, from the figures that we've shown, a lot of people that responders prefer not to say, which always means to me that there is a potential issue. And secondly, attracting that talent. And it's interesting because a question came earlier on about kind of working from home. And unfortunately, when it comes to certain types of disabilities, especially neurodiversity, that can be a blocker. And people don't necessarily learn by osmosis. They have the issues of not necessarily being able to engage with their peers and clients in exactly the same way as others do. So whilst there are pros and cons, that's certainly been identified as a potential con for people that come from a neurodiversity background. So there is definitely a lot more to do in the legal profession around, to be perfectly honest, all of the protected characteristics, but disability is certainly one that has caused me concern. So what we have done as a firm is sign up to Valuable 500, which is a signatory around really promoting and attracting diverse talent from people who identify as having a disability. We also don't call our group disability, we call it diffability, because we all have different abilities. So we feel that that is more representative of where we want to be. And we are doing internal focus at the moment, really talking about our culture, what the potential blockers are for people applying to us and how we can fix them. And when we've kind of got there, that's when we need to go external.
Thanks, Jeanette. Zahir, did you want to give your perspective from GSK?
Yeah, very quickly. I say quickly, but then I spend next 10 minutes explaining it. But let me try. From a representational targets point of view, the answer is no. Not yet. We don't, I've not seen an organization, and it's certainly not applicable to GSK, where we have representation targets for LGBT plus and disability. But, like Jeanette said, there is, LGBT plus, disability, gender, and ethnicity. These are the 4 dimensions that remain a focus areas for GSK. I think one of the reasons we don't have is it's a very busy space within D&I, and we already talked about a lot around challenges around ethnicity, still progress to be made on gender. So I'm not entirely sure when the time is right to introduce more targets, and if that is the answer. But let me just park that. But we don't have the data. I think that's hands up. We don't have the data, so the disclosure rate are low in most organization, if you take my previous organization, we were doing really well, and we disclosed our sexual orientation and disability pay gap. That's Ernst & Young in UK. So we had good quality data. We could do some exciting things with that. But in GSK, we are slightly behind. So there is more work needs to be done with our colleagues internally to build confidence and that trust piece, so they can start to share their data with us, so we can then start to inform some policy, some strategic priorities around LGBT plus and disability. I agree, finally, there is a long way to go to increase awareness on neurodiversity. It's a topic that is growing legs, but not yet fully understood and embraced in the UK market. US, for me, is slightly advanced in not only understanding, but also embracing neurodiversity. And I've seen some very good examples, initiatives in the US, some very few in the UK, but long way to go on neurodiversity.
Thank you. Do we have, I think, well, we're a few minutes over. Ben, I think you had a question.
Yeah, maybe I'll just, sorry. I'll try and make it almost like a closing question. I don't know. One thing that's very interesting, it's been, Jeanette and Zahir, thank you so much it's been so interesting to hear what you've had to say. One thing that's also very interesting, looking at the people on this call, is that we have members of the Paradigm community from each different group. And although we don't have the exact data, very coincidentally, there's actually been an age range in the different groups we have. We have give, grow, gather, and then diversity. And diversity has the kind of the youngest age bracket. And I've spoken to people in the community, and some people have actually said, oh, diversity is often a topic. I'm not saying this is true, but it's often associated with people who are younger. And one thing that Massimo, I don't know if he's still here, but that we tried to do, or we thought about when we started this 6 months ago or so, was reinforce the importance of intergenerational diversity. And I'm really curious to know what your thoughts, both Zahir and Jeanette, and also we're a new community. We've done a lot of things right. We've probably done a lot of things wrong as well. What is your advice, given we want this community really to exist in 5, 10, 20 years? Like what is your advice for us kind of long-term in terms of being good ancestors and the intergenerational side of diversity? Really curious to know, Zahir and Jeanette.
I'll go for that quickly, Ben. As both you and Corinne know, it's been a slow burn at Kingsley Napley. Started doing the work kind of 2012, and it's only within, I would say, the last 2 years that I've really got the cross section of the firm galvanized to talk about diversity. And I think that has come from essentially hard work. It's been speaking at the annual general meeting, which we have another one on Friday, which I'm talking about our reach group, then showing them what difference it's made. So one of the things that I was able to really shine a light on was what difference it had made to do that recruitment drive assessment to what we were getting in terms of trainee figures. Our trainee figures not only went up by 50% from an ethnic minority, but then those that were offered also went up by 45%. So the changes that we had put in place were making a tangible difference. People often want to see tangible difference before they will get involved. The key thing that's interesting, and this is just anecdotally from what I've seen about the intergenerational point, is that a number of people that I've spoken with when I've done panel events, etc., from the older generations have found it tricky to engage with the discussion around diversity because they've very often been in a time working when diversity and inclusion was just not on the agenda. And they've been at organisations where they felt ostracised for whatever reason that was. And they now feel in a way browbeaten and just not able to engage with the discussion in the same way that a slightly younger demographic has been. So it's really, in a way, giving them a safe space to speak about it, to talk about their issues, but also showing how they can be the forefront of teaching other people how not to do it. And it really does, that intersectional point that we've been talking about, it's really approaching people from an individual perspective and not kind of grouping people up and homogenizing them. And it can be just a very illuminating to speak to people on an individual level, especially when you've got a community like this, where you can really have open discussions with people about how you take it forward.
Great.
Yeah, I absolutely wholeheartedly agree with that. And I don't need to go any further than my own dad, who just lives in a different world when it comes to diversity and inclusion, and the conversations I have with him. He's an educated man, but just does not get what what my day job is. And it's good, the but I also, and there is an element of generalization here, but it's based on my experience. So there are, there are pros and cons. I would say that, I've got my dad who's completely against what I do. Then I have my uncle, in the same age bracket, if I can put it that way, who's very forward thinking, very pragmatic, and whose thoughts have changed as, kept with, who has changed with the society. So we've got, but in my experience, the stubbornness of an aging population, if I can put it that way, generation that is ahead of me, is much more, much more reluctant or hesitant to embrace the concept of diversity. And so the younger population, anybody who's younger than me is young for me, to be honest with you. That's how we position this. They are much more likely to be hyper connected. They're much more likely to be more tolerant. They're much more likely to give up any of their thoughts, preferences, and beliefs, because the DEI, the true work of DEI, rests on changing mindsets, altering people's beliefs. This is not an initiative. Yes, it sounds like an initiative, but what we're trying to do is get people to think differently. And and that is not always easy, particularly for somebody as like my dad. One thing I do want to say, and I'm being respectful of time, that everything we talked about, all the challenges we've talked about, they will not be solved by us looking inwardly, trying to solve them in our four walls in GSK, for example. As long as these challenges exist in our society, whether it's racism, whether it's sexism, whether it's ageism, and any kind of prejudice, bias exist in our society, they will continue to manifest one shape of the or the other in the workplace. Therefore, there is a duty upon us as an individual and as an organization to play an active role in our society to ensure that we're working towards creating and sustaining a fair and just society. It's very important, because most organizations think they can solve everything inside. No, it's not going to happen. You need to be able to play an active role with your stakeholders, consumers, clients, customers, whoever your stakeholders are, and in the community that you operate, to create and sustain that positive change.
Thanks for hearing.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and we've just got a couple leaving comments. So Shraddha, it was interesting to see the whole discussion in view of intersectionality, and that is very relevant in the Indian context where I'm from. Enjoyed the discussion immensely, and self-inquiry much needed. Thanks to here, Jeanette. And Charlotte, there are some concepts here that I know about from my 12-year-old son. I love that. And then just oh yeah, and Natalie said sorry for joining late. We're recording it, Natalie, so you can watch the whole thing all over again. So yeah, again, thank you so much, Zahir. Thank you so much, Jeanette. It's been super insightful. I've learned so much. I've been aggressively taking notes. So yeah, if and I don't know if you want to say anything else.
Yeah, no, I'm so grateful for Jeanette and Zahir giving up their time and taking so many questions as well, and letting us all have something interactive rather than something that was just like a lecture, because I think everyone, well, not to speak on behalf of everyone, but I know I certainly felt like I really gained some insights and learned a lot more than I knew an hour ago, certainly. And any more information that we take away on this topic, I think is useful, because I think we'll all go away and take at least one thing that we've heard and maybe think about it a bit further. And if we all do that, might make a difference, might make the start of a difference.
Great. All right. That's a wrap, guys. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Jeanette.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Take care.
Great session.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.